President Trump's recent sweeping electoral victory is a clear mandate for change. There is some urgency, and Trump has assembled the early stages of a team and coalition that can deliver it. It's not exactly a mystery what Elon and Vivek plan for the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. If they are successful, I believe it will unlock a golden century of progress. If not, we'll have to find some other way. There are many ways DOGE could go suboptimally. We don't want defund the police all over again. The government performs many useful and necessary functions. Turning them all off would be bad. Indeed, its indispensability creates the unmet need for efficiency, and its lack of efficiency causes real pain every day to millions of Americans whose taxes should pay for better. The ongoing success of DOGE will require relentless sales to the US public. This is what we are doing and why. This post represents my exploration of this idea. It will also be necessary to tread a fine line between half the electorate, who sees DOGE as the embodiment of a mandate for a righteous purge, and the other half of the electorate, who fears DOGE is being used as a figurehead for purely ideological revenge. Fortunately, influential voices on every side of American politics have already voiced enthusiasm for the concept. It turns out frustration with government inefficiency is shockingly bipartisan. To cut to the chase, my fundamental prescription for fixing much of what ails the government is that its agencies and managers must seize the ability to measure and reward productivity. The very concept sounds weird. Indeed, for half a century the almost pathological inability of the government to do this has been a punchline. The army has carried the American ideal to its logical conclusion. Not only do they prohibit discrimination on the grounds of race, creed, and color, but also on ability. Tom Lehrer, 1960s. It has not gotten better since then, except in rare instances. The government is larger than ever, consumes more national wealth than ever, and produces relatively little to show for this consumption. It is a problem, because people are smart and can easily understand the opportunity cost of their taxes and their time being consumed by inefficient, hidebound bureaucracies. Even as relatively tiny, privately funded companies provide infinitely better services essentially for free. When Dave has to take a day off work to spend 7 hours at the DMV, that's a tax, when the technology to automate 99.9% of the DMV's business has been freely available, in literally open-source free code, for more than a decade. The only reason that service can't be obtained faster, better, and cheaper is that government inefficiency literally makes a more rational alternative illegal. When Cheryl's small business pays more than 50% of its cash flow on payroll tax, overpriced health insurance, sales tax, and employee income tax, but any number of local government officials won't return her calls in the course of their own job, she feels powerless. She is coerced to pay for a service she can't opt out of, which can't actually do the thing it insists is vitally necessary, and will ultimately drive her out of business and her employees into unemployment and hardship. Government inefficiency spans some insane spectrum from the trillions wasted on pork projects, which is all but open corruption, to relatively tiny daily hassles and indignities. There are thousands of politically well-connected contractors who are multimillionaires and on the public dime. Then, there's the government killing a squirrel while many of our cities are overrun with crime, theft and, let's say, creative non-compliance with immigration laws. Beyond anecdotal quotidian and universally recognized experiences of the callous indifference of government spending to the customers their poor incentives insulate them from, there is a broader and deeper issue at play. We should be much richer, and yet we feel ourselves getting poorer and poorer over time. There is a terrible wealth overhang. It's 2024. We have invented artificial intelligence, and yet economic growth still grinds along at 1 or 2% per year. We should be much richer, but we're literally stuck in the past. This graph shows total factor productivity, a measure of economic efficiency growth. Since 1970 it has largely stagnated. As a result, we're twice as poor as we should be by now. To take just one example, we should have supersonic planes and flying cars, but our FAA instead squanders our drone industry, crushes general aviation, and harasses SpaceX while allowing Boeing to kill 346 people on the ill-fated 737 MAX. We should have widely affordable housing, but instead we've made houses so unaffordable that we are literally crushing the birth rate. Houses. Not some alien technology interstellar spaceship, literally a wooden box with a roof and a door, and our callous indifference to the conveyor belt of life means we've normalized spending the surplus wealth of an entire career on housing through a 35-year mortgage. Examples like this abound. Government isn't solely responsible for TFP stagnation and poor economic growth, but urgently fixing this problem requires government efficiency, and we've made zero progress in 53 years. We need to fix this now. The government should be promoting the economic growth that accumulates over time, roughly doubling the wealth of each successive generation. Instead, much of the government's activity puts a brake on economic growth or directly consumes economic surpluses. This slows down accumulation and robs our children of a better life, if we can even afford to have them. There are three main ways that a lack of government efficiency directly and negatively harms economic growth: gradually strangling the economy and cutting off opportunity, appropriating and destroying productive capital, low productivity internal consumption, and through the ever-growing regulatory burden. For the purposes of this discussion, capital is embodied wealth capable of driving the production of more capital. Over the last few hundred years, the plight of humans has improved drastically through the runaway wealth creation of a series of industrial revolutions, a process we're in danger of stalling and reversing. For example, skimming off capital gains taxes from stock appreciation in the most dynamic parts of the economy, and pouring it into administrative expenses on low efficiency, low productivity social programs. By low productivity, I mean the compounding rate of capital is very low, or zero, in comparison to the stock market or tech sector. A healthy economy allocates capital to a range of different uses with differing rates of return, including in the public sector, but importantly nearly all the long-term wealth generation, which enables social funding, is generated by the highest returning parts of the economy. To provide a concrete example, investing $10,000 into healthcare and education for children has a much higher rate of return than spending that same $10,000 on old-aged care. Indeed, in the US over 80% of lifetime spending on healthcare occurs in the last year of life, where it typically does not change outcomes or even improve quality of life. Ideally, taxes would appropriate stagnant and unproductive capital and reallocate it into more productive uses. Instead, typically governments run short on cash due to an enduring inability to impose fiscal discipline internally, so focus their tax collection efforts on the cash-generating parts of the economy, appropriating capital from the most productive, best allocating parts of the economy and then funneling it into much less productive end uses. Balancing the short-term needs for economically unproductive but ethically honorable social programs against long-term cumulative economic growth is a difficult task. But taxing capital gains to either punish insufficiently progressive California billionaires or to shake free yet more private wealth for unaccountable government uses is literally killing the golden goose. Unrealized capital gains is another level of insane. The European social democracies, which have implemented this form of mandatory state nationalization of business, i.e. communism, now face a concerted exodus of their few remaining entrepreneurs and are implementing exit taxes to punish people who believe in incentives and sweat equity for hard work. Remember the Berlin Wall? A successful system doesn't need to punish people who try to leave. Shaving off 0.5% of net economic productivity to help bolster state-funded old-age care programs and appeal to this important political constituency, such as Social Security or Medicare, is a socially worthy goal, but it comes with a long-term hangover. For example, against a backdrop of 3% annual economic growth, a 0.5% haircut drops cumulative 100-year growth from 19.2 to just 11.8, a difference of 62% additional wealth foregone. Equivalently, the slower growth track takes another 20 years, almost a whole generation, to reach the equivalent level of wealth. This is a non-trivial trade-off, but the long-term impacts of government taxation of highly productive parts of the economy in favor of less productive parts are seldom discussed or put to the vote. Remember, it's easy to rob our grandchildren of their future since they don't have a voice or a vote. Indeed, falling birth rates render their existence someday increasingly perilous. To take a concrete example, the UK's entitlement programs consume all the net economic surplus of their still relatively dynamic, productive industrial economy. The effect is near zero economic growth for 15 years, even as their population continues to age and become more dependent, starving younger people of modern infrastructure, affordable housing, economic opportunity, and children. Without children there is no future tax base. The UK, once the most powerful country on earth, has a lower GDP per capita than Mississippi, the poorest US state, even including purchasing power parity. If we exclude London, a major global city, the situation for the rest of the UK is very grim indeed. The US is only a few years behind the UK if government spending stays on trend. Handouts to all kinds of dependent electoral constituencies, ironically not including children since they don't get a vote, only ever ratchet up and are literally burning the seed corn. Yes, I believe we should help support the old, the sick, the unemployable. No, we absolutely cannot afford to cut off future growth to pay people today. As a rough rule of thumb, government spending should be at least as productive as the growth curtailed through taxation, a high but not unachievable bar. Failing that, unproductive social spending should grow no faster than the underlying economy which supports it. One major source of government inefficiency is the infinite ability of large bureaucracies to consume all their resources on high-friction internal interfaces, with almost no net product. Imagine 10, 100, 1,000 departments generating infinite reams of paperwork to be mailed back and forth, transcribed, translated, and sent back again. This tax on government productivity grows without limit because there is no mechanism to enforce bureaucratic economy, as there is in the private sector. Essentially all US government agencies are crushed by this sort of problem, with productivity per dollar far lower than the private sector. Probably the best-run agency, NASA, consumes about 10x more money per unit of output than comparable private companies, while DOD routinely consumes trillions of dollars on programs with zero output. NE spends nearly $50 billion per year and is a poster child for poor and parochial capital allocation. FCC allocated $42 billion to rural broadband and cancelled the one contract that was actually delivering. Name any agency, and a good estimate is that 90% of its employees spend 90% of their time dealing with internal bureaucracy instead of actually serving public customer needs. This is hard to fix because there's no economic incentive to reduce internal friction. Quite the opposite. In private industry, the only companies that can afford to run this badly are comfortable and low-innovation oligopolies, who often function as de facto arms of the government, or formal concessions, e.g. utilities, to avoid antitrust attention. In the dynamic, innovative parts of the economy, which is most of it, any company that develops even a tenth of the stifling process normal in government rapidly goes out of business. But government agencies never go out of business. Instead of competing for customers, they can use the coercive power of the state to force people to use them. Instead of balancing the books, they can print more money. Instead of helping their employees be as productive as possible, they can drown them in esoteric internal politics and bureaucracy, institutionalizing them and separating job security from operational success. Instead of dynamically rebalancing their assets and capabilities in response to a changing world, they'll cling to a charter enshrined in law long before anyone alive today was born, then bemoan their inability to get anything done. One particularly sinister part of bureaucratic inefficiency is that, taken to its extreme, it ends up generating the sorts of problems it was intended to prevent. That is, take a large room full of 100 well-intentioned, well-motivated, well-educated professional officials all dedicated to achieving A and preventing B, and it's only a matter of time before A is impossible and B is inevitable. For example, a major part of the Center for Disease Control, CDC's mission is to control disease, for example by stopping epidemics. Instead, various elements funded gain-of-function research in China to sidestep US ethics regulations, almost certainly creating COVID-19. When this disease spread worldwide, killing millions of people, CDC was caught flat-footed, managing to ship just 50 tests to state health agencies, all of which turned out to be defective. To take another example, NASA invested billions of dollars trying to make the space shuttle less insanely dangerous. It was never safer than about 1:100 chance of killing everyone. Multiple internal committees organized for flight assurance all theoretically had the power to prevent launch accidents like the one that destroyed Challenger, but instead became the bureaucratic mechanism necessary to launder dozens of critical ongoing hazards in a continuing program for political expediency, literally becoming the root cause of the Columbia disaster and killing another 7 astronauts. This is still happening at NASA. At the time of writing, it had been just 7 days since, despite thousands of officials in multiple national agencies all diligently assuring safety, the space station was contaminated with toxic rocket propellants. The ever-increasing pile of laws and regulations chills economic activity and is an active brake on entrepreneurship, which is vital for economic dynamism and the price competition necessary to fight inflation. Here I can share one example I've encountered in my entrepreneurship journey, illustrating the wild levels of government overreach into every aspect of the operation of law-abiding businesses. We have managed to overcome these challenges, with some effort and expense, yet another unofficial tax that actively degrades the future performance of the US economy, but dozens of other startups have not been so lucky, killed not by customer indifference or poor execution, but by a state that is actively hostile to the generation of the new wealth that it so loves to tax. There's one particular regulation in California's renewable natural gas procurement rules, set by unaccountable unelected officials, that is typographically incorrect, and will take 5 years to fix. 5 years! The US public is not stupid. Google can somehow achieve 99.9% uptime on a bewildering array of free services in nearly every country on Earth and hundreds of languages on user-controlled hardware, but the government standard is 5 years to correct a spelling error which actively harms the execution of their own mission and prevents private actors from solving major problems at zero public cost. This is nuts. This is small potatoes compared to the emerging story of Operation Choke Point 2.0, in which dozens of law-abiding entrepreneurs in the US were systematically debanked with zero warning or due process, effectively crushing their entire sector. Just last month, we were treated to the spectacle of SpaceX shipping yet another flight-ready Starship test vehicle to the launch pad after a couple of weeks of frenzied activity, only for the FAA and FWS to claim it would take them months to update paperwork that SpaceX had already supplied, at private expense. Is this a sick joke? The NRC was created 50 years ago to regulate the design and construction of nuclear power plants in the US, to provide plenty of safe, green, clean, and relatively cheap power. How many NRC-approved designs have been built and commercially operated in the US? I think the AP1000 is the only one, and just 2 have been built. DOE has poured more than $1 billion public dollars into small modular reactor, SMR, development, and NRC has not approved any SMR design except for NuScale, whose approval took 5 years and cost $500 million, severely compromising the viability of the company. These agencies are literally burning billions of your tax dollars fighting over a technology that the nuclear navy mastered in the 1950s. The mission of the regulatory state shouldn't be to extend veto power to every entity on Earth, it should be to maximize productivity and encourage and enable innovation in every sector. To the extent that this is best performed by removing regulations and regulators, do that first. Speaking of which, lawmakers make laws, over time creating an impenetrable, incomprehensible thicket of nonsense that everyone can see is strangling our economy. It is far easier to make laws than to delete them, even laws everyone agrees are counterproductive. The Federal Code of Laws and Regulations is 10 million pages. That's more than anyone could even flip through in a lifetime. It's a crazy idea, but what if you could fit all the laws of the land in a single book? It could be a big book with a lot of cross-referencing and compression, but somehow McMaster-Carr fits their entire catalog, with about 600,000 SKUs, into a single 4,000-page book. I'm reasonably fit, I should be able to carry the US Federal Code in my backpack when I fly on Southwest. If you want to add a new law, that's fine, take an old one out. When the US Federal Code was first compiled in 1874, it was less than 2,000 pages. Repvern. Enough complaints. I've outlined the various ways we should expect our government to be less of a wet blanket on economic growth. Let's actually enumerate some ideas for how to get out of this mess. Ideally, DOGE can focus on big wins that are easy to sell, rather than small, bitter zero-sum squabbles with professional petty tyrants. Even better, these wins should be multiplicative so their value compounds quickly. These strategies must unlock real economic growth, reauthorize people to build a fantastic future, including the long-overdue rebuilding of our cities and factories. The major cost drivers in government are entitlement programs and the military. Discretionary programs, though we hear a lot about them at budget time, are a small slice of the overall pie. How do we pay for this? In short, we have to get GDP up, inflation down, birth rate up, aging down. Government performance needs to catch up and then match private sector total factor productivity growth. How? For example, the IRS should not be requiring tax forms from nearly anyone. Speaking of the IRS, I think income tax should be reformed, since paychecks are not stagnant capital. Should the government, by default, operate off appropriated labor, rather than some other source? Income tax was initially temporary and applied only to a tiny fraction of the population. To take Stuart Buck's example, as economics professor Jason Arbaluk has pointed out, if we fired a bunch of DMV workers, that wouldn't make anyone's life better. People still need to renew their driver's license or vehicle registration, and if each employee now has to handle the work of 2 or 3 people, we'll all be stuck in line forever. This is typical of backwards thinking on regulatory reform. If we fire half the DMV, it will make it twice as bad. What a galaxy brain take! No, the DMV needs to function like a business that must serve its customers competitively, not make them wait in line for 7 hours to attempt to file some form that A, should not even exist, delete, and B, should be completely automated, and C, should be serviceable online. In what universe is it some unalterable law of physics that people need to renew their license in person, and it will always take some $15 per hour bureaucrat 20 minutes to process it over a counter in person? What fraction of road accidents are caused by unlicensed or otherwise non-compliant drivers anyway? Our car insurance companies have a much better idea about whether we should be licensed and registered, and there's zero excuse that in 2024, any government organization can extort the general public with unthinking contempt for the value of their time and the dignity of their personhood. I don't unconditionally love credit rating agencies, but imagine if getting a credit card required an annual trip to the local state department of credit cards, where you had to wait in line for the whole day for the right to transact. Or take this bewildering example of hiring in government. Of course, every agency has its own quirks and hacks to try to solve these problems. But consider that the government workforce is populated by people who have to A, run the gauntlet of these insane hiring processes that are actively repulsive to people with talent and ambition, B, government promotion is very slow and pay is notoriously low, and C, civil service protections make it nearly impossible to fire anyone for underperformance. Level 1 is let's fix this hiring process. Level 2 is let's delete this job rec altogether. Why are we seeking to staff a job that can be filled by anyone who successfully navigates this process? Inflation is caused by increases in demand that can't be met by supply for some reason. There are many ways to do this. Printing money increases demand. Price controls inhibit supply. Overregulation of production inhibits supply, e.g. housing, healthcare. Cartels inhibit supply. Inflation is a tax on liquid capital. The optimal amount of inflation is not zero, but it is low. In general, zero or negative inflation incentivizes hoarding unproductive cash, causing liquidity problems driving up the cost of capital. Slight inflation, well below general economic growth, creates a hot potato effect and incentivizes people to spend wealth, creating more wealth, rather than hoarding it. But excessive government spending through borrowing expands the money supply faster than the economy can grow, causing the supply-demand imbalance that drives inflation. This problem is intensified when most of that additional money supply is spent on unproductive government service activities or given away explicitly to maintain consumer spending, as during COVID. If it were the case that the government could allocate capital better than the private sector, printing money to increase government activity would decrease inflation and increase wealth even more quickly. Note that this has never occurred, for structural reasons that are obvious enough to anyone who has ever worked in, or closely with, government. Inflation is also inherently regressive. It harms the poor far more than the rich, whose wealth is generally preserved in far less inflationary stores, including stocks and real estate. This chart breaks inflation down by some different kinds of products and services and finds that, relatively speaking, cash's ability to obtain consumer electronics has strengthened while its ability to purchase the fundamentals of living, housing, healthcare, education, childcare, have weakened. Without exception, excessive cost growth in consumer goods and services occur in highly and overregulated sectors, whose regulations exist to capture the industry in the hands of incumbents and prevent competition, a fundamental feature of capitalism, from lowering prices. There's a lot of existing law intended to prevent this sort of abuse, including antitrust regulations. It's not working. Delete. Reflect on how much of a tax our society pays for healthcare and housing, two things that are scarce by choice. We have chosen to make housing scarce, a technology we've had for 10,000 years. In the short term, it drove up prices for the middle-class boomers. In the longer term, it secured municipal power for landowners at the expense of renters, the young, poor, the sick, and the new. But now much of the country is full of stagnating dormitory suburbs built half a century ago for young families, now termite-ridden and occupied by a wave of retirees who cannot afford in-home care and other basic services they need, while their children can't afford to form families, because short-sighted policies, Prop 13 in CA, among others, literally burned the seed corn necessary to renew these communities. It does no one any good to sit on a $1 million home no one can afford to retrofit, buy, renovate, maintain, live in, or sell. Meanwhile, tens of millions of Americans suffer and die every year from the effects of old age. In the richest country on earth, we spend $50 billion on healthcare research through the knee alone, with less than $50 million of that, less than 0.1%, on anti-aging research. Anti-aging is the one technology that multiplicatively solves nearly all healthcare spending. Young people don't suffer frailty, neurological conditions, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, etc., etc. NE dumps billions of dollars every year into ill-conceived research efforts on degenerative diseases while spending almost nothing on root and branch prevention. Study after study finds that 80% of researchers funded by the NE believe they'd be more productive if making their own decisions about research direction, and a huge chunk of publicly funded research is afflicted by the replication crisis. Recently it has become clear that most of the last 20 years of Alzheimer's research was based on faked research overseen by a cabal of very senior leaders in academia and government who execute an enormously inefficient capital allocation process explicitly intended to prevent this type of abuse, but instead often becoming its root cause. See the similar examples above on CDC creating COVID and NASA blowing up space shuttles. If we invented a drug that slowed aging by 10%, we'd save $240 billion per year, 4% right off the top of the federal budget. And we'd get to live another 10 years in decent health. 1% of the entire federal budget funds dialysis, yet another incredibly expensive treatment of a disease of old age. The revealed preference of people in every country, culture, and community on Earth is that they produce children when they can provide for them. Children are vitally necessary to produce the workers and wealth of tomorrow. In the absence of sufficient wealth, we see the emergence of rationalizations for the abandonment of our vitally necessary collective mission of social production and renewal, such as the harmful myths that the world is overpopulated or its resources are nearing limits. How to fix this? This chart shows that families at the upper end of U.S. income continue to have enough children to maintain population. Indeed, if we'd stayed on the Henry Adams curve, U.S. GDP would be about $160,000 per capita, and half our families would be above 2.0 children naturally. If, in addition, we had kept housing affordable, we would currently be in the middle of the next baby boom. There is a massive baby overhang. We need to turn this around ASAP. How long to double growth and halve housing cost? For years? Let's do it. DOGE presents a rare opportunity for us to recognize the vital role government plays in safeguarding future prosperity, and to reflect on what an effective, efficient government would do to serve this end. It is no longer acceptable for us to accept stagnation and decline because of a mere inability to imagine a radically better future. Instead, let's work together to find ways to unlock the radical catch-up growth we need to finally lift all humans far out of poverty, cut away the scourge of old age and disease, and push our species forward to the stars.